Mick, good to see you. Happy New Year. I hope your family and you had a good Christmas, a good New Year.
Hello, Sean. It's lovely to see you. Of course, seeing you as the first person in 2025 is sort of make me scratch my head as to why I agreed to do this, but that's
This
okay.
this must be this is an omen for a great 2025. So you're welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's great to see you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. So the thing that's interesting to me is there's so much that's predicated on the budget when it comes to Donald Trump and his agenda, right? Spending this, cutting taxes. So I really think it's important because we hear a lot of sound bites in the media. And what I really want you to do as a guy that was a champion of deficit cutting and spending reduction in the Congress and then OMB director is just really give us a lay of the land of where we are. So I want to walk through this rather methodically.
Okay.
Let's just start with this. How much do we as a government currently spend? I mean, roughly.
I think it's $6.5 trillion. But even that is it's not misleading, but it's not the end of the discussion. The government spending is really broken into two giant buckets. There's what's called mandatory spending, also called entitlement spending. Some people don't like that term, so I just call it automatic spending, also known as off-budget spending. I want to say that's 5 trillion, 4.5 trillion this year, something like that. The biggest pieces of that are Medicare, Medicaid. Why do we call that mandatory spending, entitlement spending, automatic spending? Because that money gets spent automatically. Once you turn 65, you get Medicare. There's no bill passed every single year to set a budget for it. There's no rules set every single year. It's sort of set off all by itself, and it happens automatically by operation of law. Of course, Social Security is the same way. Once you qualify for it, you get the money. The other bucket is the discretionary budget, which is the stuff that, discretionary spending, which is what the president budgets and what Congress votes on as a budget sometimes and does in their spending bills. That's the stuff that gets spent every single year and has to be respent or at least reauthorized, reappropriated every single year. So you got those two big buckets, one mandatory, one discretionary. Together, it's almost $7 trillion next year.
Okay. So let's continue with the big picture before I want to break down mandatory and discretionary in a minute, but let's just start with continuing down the big picture path.
Yeah.
Of that 6.1 trillion-ish dollars, how much of it are we spending in terms of creating a deficit? How much do we have versus how much do we spend? What's the deficit roughly every year?
Well, right now it's about $1 trillion every 100 days. Keep in mind, just like there are two buckets for money out, there's more than one bucket for money in. The mandatory spending has its own money in. These are your Social Security taxes and your Medicare taxes. And then over on the discretionary side, you have things like the individual income tax and the corporate tax. If we're spending, let's say for sake of this discussion, let's just say it's $6 trillion and you're going to run a $2 trillion deficit, that means you're bringing in through all buckets about $4 trillion. So these are just huge numbers. By the way, Sean, to put it in perspective, it's been a long time since I wrote a budget. The last budget I wrote, I think by myself was 2000, not by myself, but Russ Vogt wrote them once I went over to be the chief of staff, was the 2018 or 19 budget. And it was just over $4 trillion. So that's how quickly the government is growing.
Okay. So for sake of argument, we spend $6 trillion, we have $4 trillion. How do we finance that $2 trillion of deficit spending? Well, I mean, if you had a credit card, you're basically, in theory, putting it on there.
Yeah, and the credit card analogy holds a little bit. We could talk about that, during the show and so forth. But generally speaking, what happens is that Treasury borrows it. And they'll go out and they say, oh, we need $2 trillion this year, so we will issue $2 trillion worth of Treasury bonds, notes, whatever, short-term bills, all of the Treasury borrowing together. We'll just call them treasuries. And they offer that out to the market, say, please lend us $2 trillion. The largest purchaser of those is the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve doesn't actually have any money, which means that technically we end up printing the money. It just goes through this sort of this kabuki dance of quantitative easing and indicating to the markets that the Federal Reserve will buy them. But the bottom line is we borrow the money and in essence then print it.
Who else owns that money?
Oh,
those
it
debts?
used to be a lot of Chinese, and I know I got this a lot back in 2010 when I was running for Congress. Foreign nations owned a bunch of them. That is actually winding off. The Chinese have slowed their purchases of treasuries, so they actually, I think, now are net shrinking the size of their treasury holdings. Right now, the largest purchaser of our debt is the Federal Reserve.
So in the same way that if you need to spend $10, you have eight, and you come to me and say, "Can I borrow two?" I give you the two, and then there's interest on that, right? So when
Yeah.
they float these bonds, that's another big chunk of the budget, right? Paying them back.
Yeah, back in 2017, 18, I think the budget for the what we spent on interest was about $350 billion. It's going to be close to $1 trillion this year. So yes, the interest carry is a real thing, just like it is on your credit card bill. Again, the credit card breaks down a little bit when you realize that you've also got, you sort of have to figure out a way to give the analogy of you owning a printing press in your basement, because that's what the government does. But yeah, the credit card analogy holds to the extent that interest is real. We have to pay it, and we do pay it, and it's about $1 trillion this year.
Okay, one more number because I want to get back to the interest for a second.
Yeah,
Just so our total, that's our deficit. What we run every year, we're about $2 trillion in that we're running a deficit. That gets added to the debt. What we owe totality wise in terms of a country. Where's that stand right now?
yeah, and by the way, that's an important distinction that not a lot of people, including some elected officials, don't make. The deficit is what we are short this year. The debt is the accumulated shortfalls from the beginning of time. That number, the debt, is about $36 trillion.
Okay, and last question on that before we move backwards a little. When you say from the beginning of time, I know that that's just a turn of phrase, but the reality is that debt, that national debt, that $36 trillion has pretty much come in the modern era, right?
Oh yeah, but the federal government. I don't think the federal government has ever been entirely out of debt. I could be wrong about that. Maybe early in the 19th century we were, but generally speaking, the government has always held a little bit of a debt. When you look at the graph and you look at the changes in the way the government operated, the debt, the deficits, and then the accumulated deficits, the debt, really started exploding in 1980 or thereabouts. Which is one of the stories I tell when people say, "Oh, I can't believe the Democrats have done this to us." No, 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 no. It takes two parties to get you $36 trillion in debt. Think about who the president was.
It's a lot of people that spend, it's like a bar tab.
Yeah, it's really hard to spend that much money without everybody doing it to you. So yeah, it took off about 1980. That's when Republicans realized that they can cut taxes, and Democrats realized they could increase spending. They'd have to borrow a bunch of money to do those things, but no one lost their job in Washington because of it. So that's when this sort of modern unholy alliance of reducing taxes and also increasing spending came together.
All right, so let's work backwards for a second. We talked about interest on the debt. You said it's just north of $1 trillion, right? So if we're spending $6 trillion and basically 1/6 of it is interest payments on the debt, that would seem to me that we're crowding out a lot of other opportunities.
You think so, but we don't, because in the real world it would. And I suppose eventually it would, but I mean, I've been doing this eventually thing now for 15 years. I feel like the crazy guy on the corner holding up a sign saying, "Repent, the end of the world is nigh." Sooner or later, that guy's going to be right. But he hasn't been so far, and neither have I. Yes, it does tend, the spending the money does tend to crowd out. But when you can simply borrow more money, what difference does it make? And that's how Washington has looked at it. They're like, "Oh my goodness, yes, we have $1 trillion we have to pay in interest this year. That's $1 trillion that we don't have to spend on fill in the blank, the military, welfare, whatever's important to you. So what do? We'll just go borrow another $1 trillion to fill the hole that the other $1 trillion worth of interest payments has left." So yeah, that's how you do end up in that cycle.
But we had Victor Davis Hanson on the show earlier.
Yeah.
And he was like, going back to Constantinople, if you actually look at interest versus outlays for national defense, when the interest exceeds the spending on national defense, that's when great societies, great countries collapse. And we have reached that point.
Yeah. Well, most great nations don't fail from the outside. They rot from the inside, and they do it through the debasement of the currency, which is really what we're doing when we print all of this money. You can go back and look at the Roman Empire, and what they essentially did is they have a silver coin that was 100% silver, and then 100 years later it was 2% silver. They debased the currency. We're doing the modern version of that by printing and borrowing so that we can pay for what we've already spent.
All right, so let's continue into the discretionary stuff. Actually, yeah, on the discretionary stuff, that funds stuff like education, defense, right? Yeah. There's a lot of times when people want to talk about making cuts. That's primarily where they're talking about, right?
Is it? I mean, yeah, yes. I mean, that's, again, Washington loves the fact that no one understands their language. There was a very prominent Republican who wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal just before Christmas saying our real problem is mandatory spending. And they love to say that, so it takes the eyes off of discretionary spending that they vote on every single year. So it looks like it's not really their fault that we're $36 trillion in debt. But the discretionary budget is not big enough to make up the shortfall, right? You could cut the discretionary budget to zero and we'd still be in a deficit this year. That's how big the interest payments are.
Hold on. Repeat that for 1 second. So you're talking defense, education.
No money for defense. No defense, transportation, education, all of the discretionary budget. Again, Social Security, Medicare is over here in the mandatory bucket. But take the alphabet soup, USDA, FBI, CIA, FDA, all of that, DOD. Okay, you could cut that to zero this year, and we would still be in deficit.
I mean, when you stop and pause and realize what that means, that's how bad we're in, right? Okay, so let me just keep going down this route.
And I don't want to. You know me. One of the reasons that I don't have as many friends in Washington as I would probably like is that I'm happy to blow up my own party from time to time when they do things that make no sense to me. But there was a recent press conference when a bunch of senators got together and said, "Oh, we love this Doge thing, and what we are going to look at is getting rid of the penny." And that's going to be a big deal because we lose a lot of money on making the penny. It costs us 3 cents to make a penny or something like that. And it's true. And it is wasteful, and you should get rid of it. Sean, it's hard to imagine how small that affects our deficits.
I'm glad you brought that up, though. Yeah. Because I always tell people, leading into the 1994 contract with America, Newt Gingrich walked around with an ice bucket. And viewers of the show know how many times I've used this example. And it costs like $200,000. 5 staffers brought ice around to members' offices so that they could have their afternoon drinks, right? And now, obviously, they have free. I mean, you know this from being a member of Congress. You have a refrigerator and a freezer. But some kid's friend's brother knew a member of Congress and got this patronage job, and Newt Gingrich cut it. And here's the point that I would make. I get it. That saved $200,000. The penny saves what? Call it $1 million, $2 million. But if you don't respect that, then how are you ever? I mean, that's my concern. Is that we've gotten to a point in Washington where it's like, that's only $1 million. Hey, I'll take $1 million.
No, you're spot on, right? Which is, I said, look, it's important, but my problem is with people who say we're going to fix it by doing that.
Oh, right.
I have friends of mine who say, you know what? The real problem here is foreign aid. That is a laughable proposition. You could cut foreign aid for all the foreign aid we've ever given in the history of the country, including the Marshall Plan, and it still wouldn't dent that $36 trillion deficit that we have. The numbers are so big, and our attention is sometimes on these really small things that we sort of lose sight of how we got here.
All right, so I want to continue with discretionary for just a minute, knowing the context in which we're discussing this and the impact it would really have.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about real money with the entitlement. But as I said, I look at it as a sign of respect. I go to work every day, you go to work every day, and the government says, I want you to send me this much money. And my view is, I get it. I'm an American. I'm proud to live in this country. And I get that there's a cost to it. To be free, to be protected by a military, to be supported by various agencies and whatever that are looking out, that I drive on the roads. I get it. There's a cost. But I only want to pay as many pennies as I have to because I don't want to work as much. I mean, let's just be honest. And I want some respect for the dollars that I send to Washington. So put me inside the role of a member of Congress, because I have brought this up before. For example, why in the day and age that we live in today do we need government funding for PBS and NPR and the National Endowment for the Humanities?
Okay. By the way, and you're absolutely right. And I don't want to diminish the efforts to be efficient everywhere we possibly can. You talk about the ice buckets. I wasn't there. I don't remember that. When I got to Congress, we still had people sitting on the elevators punching the buttons for us. Not making that up. That's changed. Okay. So I'm not trying to discredit that.
No. And I know you're not. I know you're not. You're just trying to put it into perspective.
I'm trying to put it.
But I guess
you need to solve that and 15 million other things. So why doesn't it change? And why is it so hard to change? I'm trying to figure out the analogies to give. People don't understand what baseline budgeting, which is the Congress doesn't go back to zero every single year and start from scratch on its budget. It's too big. They make the argument, well, we can't do that. There's not enough time in the year. So what we do essentially said, okay, this is what we spent last year. We're going to use that as a base. Where are we going to increase our spending for next year? They also say we're going to look at reduction, but we never really do.
Right. Okay. So walk me through my example. I'm Congressman from, who cares, from Virginia. I go into the state of the Republican conference. Guys and ladies, we all know that we're principled conservatives. PBS and NPR are a complete anathema to what we believe in terms of free and fair competition.
Sure.
Should we cut this? No, and everybody says, yeah. Then why does it? Why can't we just stop it?
I'll give you a real world example. Okay, I cut the PBS budget in the president's proposed budget of 2017. Okay, PBS doesn't need our money anymore. The government subsidy for them is a small portion of what they could do. They could sell ads. They could do a bunch of things. They don't need the dough. Yet here we are, talk about respect for the taxpayers, giving money to effectively the progressive side of the country so they can promote their own agendas and so forth. That's wrong. It was a taxpayer protection budget in 2017. This is a wonderful example. Okay. Well, I went to the president and said, look, here's what I want to do. By the way, there's going to be some high profile cuts. And one of these is PBS. And he looks at me and goes, well, I'm good with that, because all my friends got plenty of money. They could give more money to it.
Exactly.
Right? Okay, wait, finish. And of course, then the Democrats in the Senate go, oh my God, Donald Trump hates Big Bird. He hates Big Bird. What is he? He hates the children of America. He's gutting this program. He hates you. He hates poor people. He hates young people. He hates whatever. I can't believe he's doing this. And in the Oval Office, okay, you had gone by then, but you would know the name. I will not give the person's name out. That's not the purpose of this. There was a Republican member of the senior team who said, Mr. President, we can't do this. We can't be seen as being too harsh on PBS and Big Bird. We have to fund this. It's just not worth the PR hit that we are taking. That was a Republican senior advisor to the president.
And I know you know this, but I, as a previous staffer to the budget committee, one of the dirty secrets about PBS is the following. They basically license shows. So Sesame Street is a product. If you actually listen to the show,
it's for profit.
It's a for-profit. Big Bird's a millionaire. He makes a boatload of cash, or whatever his pronouns are. Big Bird is a millionaire.
Do you know who owns the Muppets now? It's Disney, for crying out loud. So, this happened. But there are Republicans. Look, I sat in there in 2018 with my 2017 with my 2018 budget. I got a call. One of the very first calls I got from the president. I was over at OMB. He calls me, he says, yeah, Mick, you need to come down here right now. I said, yes, Mr. President. I haven't been there very often. I go down, and there, sitting across the Resolute desk, is a very high-ranking Republican senator. And the president calls me, he says, Mick, come in. Senator so-and-so's got some problems with your budget. I said, yes, sir. I figured he probably would. Sit down. And the president looks at the senator, goes, now, senators, tell him what you just told me. So, Mr. President, I'm happy to say it. I have a great deal of respect for Mr. Mulvaney. Everybody knows he's one of the best guys in town with numbers. He understands the budget better than probably anybody. And this budget would probably be something that made Ronald Reagan smile from a philosophical standpoint. But let me tell you one thing, Mr. President. There's one difference between you and him. You are elected. He is not. And nobody has ever lost their job in this town for spending too much money. People have lost their job for not spending enough. Now, how do you feel about Mr. Mulvaney's budget? And that, Sean, was the end of fiscal conservatism in the Trump administration.
Is there, okay. What about members? Okay, that's from the executive to Congress. Is there any way? I mean, what I have argued is start to shame people into spending issues, right? So start to run around and say, who wants to defend PBS? Who wants to defend it? And start with the Congress and move the other way, because according to the Constitution, actually, technically speaking, Congress has the power of the purse.
Well, look at what just happened before Christmas. On that very first vote they had before Christmas on the continuing resolution. What is a continuing resolution? A continuing resolution is a bill that says, look, we don't have the time, we don't have the interest, we don't have the ability right now to sort of plan for next year. So what we're going to do on sort of a short-term basis is take whatever we spent last year and spend it again this year. Okay? $2 trillion in deficit last year. $2 trillion in deficit last year. And all but 33 Republicans just voted and said, you know what? That's good enough for next year. Let's take last year's model and spend it again next year for at least part of the year. All but 3 dozen Republicans voted for that.
The thing that was funny, I thought this is where you're going to go, but like the thing about this was, I agree with you. I'm a purist. You want to find a continuing resolution, go for it, because that is continue spending until we get our act together, right? And what did they throw in that first 1,547-page bill? A pay raise for themselves, exempting themselves from Obamacare, moving the Commanders NFL stadium. That's not a continuing resolution. That's a Christmas tree.
Yeah, but that never came to the vote. That never came to the vote. Yeah.
By the way, what was this to your example? What was the thing? You're cutting cancer research.
Yeah, that was in a previous. That was the one that didn't come up for the vote. That was in the 15th.
Right, but my point is,
yes,
there's always some.
There's a lot of folks who are willing to vote for that. Right.
But so generally, I guess what I'm trying to get at, and what I want people to understand, is should they have any hope that we can actually cut spending, get rid of, I mean, we did it in 94. I felt like at least slowed the rate of growth. I mean, that's the other dirty little
you did.
secret.
Yeah, you slowed the rate. Keep in mind, that's a critical word you just used. You slow the rate of growth. And in Washington, that's a cut. Okay. I'm not making this up, Sean. If you
No. I want people to understand what you're saying, though. Let's role play this. Mick, I have $5 this year. Can I have 10 next year?
Yeah, that's a cut.
No. Then you say, give me 8. I'll give you 8. And I go, you cut my budget too.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. So the language is different in Washington, D.C. But go back to the question, which is really the $64,000 question. Is there hope? There will be once voters change their policies, once voters change their attitude. Keep in mind, that Republican sitting in the Oval Office with the president in 2017 was right. No one's ever lost his job in Washington, D.C. for spending too much money. And until the voters, if you put yourself in the voters, this is a representative government. So here I am, I'm a member of Congress. My folks back home, last year I spent way too much money. I went deficit spending. Then I went back to my people, said, please reelect me. And they did. Why would I change my position? Why would I change my voting policy? If you just gave me your seal of approval, why would I continue to do what I've done before you voted for me? So yeah, the voters have to change. Right now, there's a group of voters who really like the spending. Most of them tend to be on the left of center, but certainly not all of them. Typically, Sean, what I like to say is Republicans and Democrats like to spend as much money as each other. They just like to spend it on different things. Republicans like to spend it on defense. Democrats like to spend it on social welfare programs. But they like to spend. And until the voters decide, you know what, I'm going to vote for somebody who wants to spend less, it is not going to change.
Well, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell to get more.